As was the case in many other installations within this series, the American airline industry and the corresponding airports located throughout the nation had been undergoing severe economic woes due to a massive decline in air travel, as many of the nation's inhabitants could scarcely afford to fly during the current crushing economic conditions before the initiation of hostilities had occurred. At this point in time, as the nation was now just beginning to mobilize its Guard and Reserve forces to distribute them throughout many major metropolitan areas to defend critical infrastructure, these were now, as they were surviving on generous subsidies from the state-federal regimes, seen as key linchpins in the local defense networks as logistical and forward operating bases. As a result, the airports located throughout the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex were now being utilized in such a capacity, as the Sino-Russian naval drills had been occurring off both coasts of the nation prior to the kickoff of hostilities. The airports were now beginning to be established as said forward operating bases and key logistical sites, as air resupply was a strength that America had possessed prior to the invasion, as America had a large fleet of support aircraft within its Air Force, especially its air logistical capabilities, as it had an enormous airlift capability with many cargo aircraft within its air forces. As the airports were also seen as highly critical objectives of the Sino-Russian coalition forces for essentially the same reasons, these would be enormously contested sites throughout the nationwide invasion. And as the Meacham International Airport in Fort Worth was at this time being overrun by the light mechanized infantry forces, namely a light mechanized infantry battalion from within the 24th Light Infantry Brigade of the PLA's 59th Reserve Group Army, the DFW International Airport, which was much larger and even more important, would in effect be struck by massive armored forces, as 3 entire armored battalions from the 35th Armored Brigade of the 59th Group Army, with heavy artillery support, even some cruise missile support coming from across the border in Mexico from the reserve battalions from within the 612th and 613th that have been called up to bolster the active duty battalions that ordinarily comprise these strategic missile forces brigades from the PLA's Eastern Theater Command. Some of these reserve battalions fired the DH-10A long-range but subsonic cruise missiles. However, these were very accurate and very destructive weapons and had a very long range as well, which made up for the fact that they were subsonic. China also had supersonic cruise missiles as well, but the subsonic cruise missiles were produced in enormous quantities, and the Chinese were eager to effectively use these enormous stockpiles of missiles at all costs. And many of these would hit many targets throughout the South Central invasion sector, and the DFW battle was no less as critical of a target as any other major area, as there were many key military and military-industrial sites within the Dallas-Fort Worth area that the Americans were eager to defend, and as they had distributed their different forces of National Guard and reservists throughout the state of Texas and neighboring states such as Oklahoma and to a lesser extent New Mexico, as they were even slower to mobilize their forces than were Texas and even Oklahoma, these forces located in the major cities were in effect called up to defend what comprised effectively the nation as its core, as in its defense industries, its ability to make war, and its ability to function as a nation, as many of these critical sites were located within these major cities and were thus of dire importance to the defending forces. As the PLA's forces all throughout the entire battle space were on the move, including the most mobile of all the forces, which was the attached 83rd Air Assault Brigade of the PLA's active duty 83rd Group Army, which was currently fighting in the Houston battle, although their Air Assault Brigade had been effectively handed over to be attached to the PLA's 59th Group Army to give them additional capabilities that they didn't otherwise have. Now that they had these air assault forces, they put them to excellent use by disrupting any conceivable possibility of the defenders effectively coalescing and comprising any coherent defenses in the downtown areas of both Dallas and Fort Worth, as well as also conducting critical operations at the Americans' largest logistical hub, which was the DFW International Airport, as well as also as the 3rd of the 144th, a mechanized infantry battalion of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, was located in Irving, Texas, to defend critical sites in this particular area just south of the airport and throughout Irving, as its comprising companies had been effectively split up in this area. The air assault forces would effectively land at the southern end of the DFW International Airport, completely cut off any conceivable means of retreat by the 156th Brigade Engineering Battalion, which was a combat engineer battalion, as well as also the 3rd of the 133rd, an artillery battalion within the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team. As the 3rd of the 144th, as well as the 2nd of the 142nd, and the 1st of the 124th Cav, in addition to the 949th Brigade Sport Battalion, and the Independent Headquarters Company over the entire 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, which was effectively its command elements, comprised the entirety of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team. As there was also 2 additional battalions from other units in this area. One, the 2nd of the 198th, an armored battalion from the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, which also was of the 36th Infantry Brigade Combat, or the 36th Infantry Division, as was the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team. However, the other battalion in question, the 1st of the 204th, a SHORAD battalion equipped with the Avenger short-range air defense systems, were effectively from the 66th Troop Command of the Mississippi National Guard, an entirely different unit from the 36th Infantry Division, and were mobilized, federalized, and called in to provide force protection for the Naval Air Station and surrounding military-industrial complexes such as the Lockheed Martin plant directly to the south of the Naval Air Station itself. However, as the invasion had kicked off at midnight and the enormous air power of the PLAAF had arrived between 30 and 35 minutes later, this would also not only play a role in the total absolute annihilation of the Naval Air Station and the forces on the Meacham International Airport, which was being established as a forward logistical site in addition to the Naval Air Station in the Fort Worth area. The key logistical site that was being created at the International Airport of the Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport was to be the largest FOB and supply base in the entire metro area to supply all the forces protecting critical sites throughout it. But as the air assault forces would play a key role from the 83rd, 2 of its air assault battalions would again move into the south of the International Airport and cut off all lines of retreat for the 156th Brigade Engineering Battalion and the 3rd of the 133rd Artillery Battalion of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, and also prevent any possibility of any nearby companies from the 3rd of the 144th, as communications would be cut with the tandem anti-SAT and cyber strikes and booting on of electronic warfare assets, both ground-based from the 59th Group Army's Electronic Warfare Regiment and those that were aboard the H-6Ks and the JH-7 squadron, as these carried the very potent and state-of-the-art, state-of-the-industry KG-600 electromagnetic jamming pods. As these communications would be cut, it was still possible to relay messages as independent travelers that were effectively civilians, whether non-combatant or armed civilians, could effectively spread information between not only other civilians but also nearby military forces and effectively warn them of the invasion forces and their operations. But as the air assault forces would land rapidly, as effectively this entire operation would be like a lightning strike, a karate chop to the throat, these 3 armored battalions from the 35th would strike from 3 directions: north, east, moving east, and moving west. And as this would effectively make the entire international airport surrounded, as the air assault forces would get there first and cut off the south, the forces defending the site would effectively be totally surrounded, completely cut off, hit by heavy artillery forces, as the artillery battalion within the 35th, equipped with the potent self-propelled PLZ-05 155mm howitzers, would fire enormous artillery salvos against the American forces on the site. Not only would the artillery fire be heavy, as the entire battalion would be effectively focused on this operation after initially, for the first 45 minutes, bombarding armed reactionary civilian elements to support their other forces attacking them. The artillery would then reorient its efforts at the forces that were on the international airport site, as their own SHORAD battalion would sit a bit further back from the operation with their SP AAA 95 SHORAD systems that equipped the battalion's firing batteries. The artillery, with air power coming from 2 pairs of JH-7 strike aircraft coming in from the JH-7 squadron, along with even some of the fighter aircraft dropping their limited air-to-ground munitions, as they were predominantly armed with air-to-air munitions on their first sortie. However, some of these J-10 fighters and J-11 fighter aircraft did have small numbers of air-to-ground munitions. There were 2 pairs of these aircraft in each squadron that carried 4 1,000-pound air-to-ground laser-guided munitions, and these would be dropped in support of the armored operations against the international airport. There would also be enormous strategic carpet munitioning conducted by one of 2 H-20 stealth bomber aircraft, which each one alone carried 45 tons or 90,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions, which was simply colossal. These would strike key aviation industrial sites and other critical sites located around the airport, as the armored forces would effectively move in and capture the entire site from the American combat engineers and artillerymen that were defending it, as they would have enormous air power support from the PLAAF, as their 2 pairs of JH-7s and 1 pair each of J-10s and J-11s would come in and effectively drop their air-to-ground munitions on the dug-in targets, as the combat engineers actually somewhat built up airport. They were even given 9 anti-tank mines, which a small limited minefield was beginning to be created on the west-facing side of the international airport. However, Chinese intelligence gathered by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system through the ISR, and also the hacking of American systems, had informed the PLA forces on where exactly these minefields were being prepared, and thus would guide them in their movements around these minefields. As the armored infantry forces that were part of these armored battalions, as each armored battalion had 2 armored infantry companies, 1 anti-tank company of the AFT-10, ATGM systems with their HJ-10s. These were very powerful and destructive anti-tank systems that could also destroy other types of targets. These, along with the tank companies themselves, as each battalion had 4 tank companies of the state-of-the-art Type 96B main battle tanks, would simply rapidly and violently strike the American forces defending the airport. As also in the south, as the air assault forces would effectively arrive first, they would clear a path with their combat aviation companies, as each of the 2 battalions landing had its own combat aviation company, making 2 total, and would strike the American forces in the south of the International Airport site, as this again was being developed as a forward operating base and to be a critical linchpin, not just logistically, but as an installation, as it survived on regime subsidies and could thus be used any way the regime seemed fit, and thus we're going to transform this into a FOB for the entirety of the 56th Infantry Brigade combat team. These forces were motivated to fight hard to defend this site, as the artillery had been dug in by combat engineering forces who tried to prepare this forward operating base / logistical base defenses to the absolute best of their ability, as the Bear Creek golf course was effectively in the southwest corner of the airport. It was immediately adjacent to it and might as well have been part of its grounds. This site was incorporated into part of the defenses when in terms of the outer perimeter of the airport itself. And thus, there was one battery from the 3rd of the 133rd that had been dug in this area, again, by the combat engineers creating defenses such as berms and sandbag emplacements and more, and thus would have to be dealt with by the Chinese Z-10 attack helo gunships and the CH-901A loitering munitions, as well as the AFT-10 systems firing their potent HJ-10 ATGMs, as these were a very long-range anti-tank guided missile at 6.2 miles as its maximum range, as well as the tanks and their capability to fire ATGMs as well, which outranged many other vehicles that the Americans possessed, as well as also the standard ammunition having quite a range to it of just over 4 kilometers, or just over several miles. As the air assault forces would indeed cut off the retreat of American forces, as their communications again would be down, and initiative would have to be taken at the company level, or in the case of artillery or air defense forces, the battery level. The company commanders would effectively be commanding their forces within earshot or line of sight communications, as again, they would have no radio contact, as the radios were being jammed by the electronic warfare as well. No satellite-based technology worked, no internet-based technology worked, everything was effectively down. The Americans, again, were in a worse position than the Iraqis in the first Gulf War, and they, in effect, would be suffering in much the same manner. As the air assault forces were beginning to conduct their initial landing operation, arriving just before the armored forces were coming onto the scene to attack from the north, the east, and the west, the first landing of the first 2 air assault infantry companies from each of the 2 battalions was already underway within the first 45 minutes of the entire operation, as the clock at midnight and the artillery barrage had begun. The American forces on the airport had braced themselves for something massive, as the air power again would arrive between 30 and 35 minutes into the invasion. The air assault forces waited until approximately 12:35 to begin their approach towards the airport, getting there by about 12:40 to 12:45 a.m. and beginning their assault. As this was going on, as the clearing of a landing zone was occurring with the gunships, as well as also loitering munitions fired at the battalion level by the battalion headquarters combat drone sections, which operated the TEL-based 48 tube systems from the armored battalions that were attacking the international airport. These would give valuable support to the landing of the air assault PLA troops. As during all of these operations, as well as the attack on the Naval Air Station, which was occurring concurrently, followed very shortly before the end of the first hour by the assault against the Meacham International Airport, as there were no American supply aircraft having had made it before the hostilities had kicked off at the DFW International. There was, in fact, a C-17 Globemaster that was on the tarmac at the Meacham International, which would be destroyed by a cruise missile landing immediately beside it in order to do minimal damage to the runway system itself. As all of this was going on, as the first of the 124th was being ripped to shreds, and two of its combat companies would even retreat and temporarily be spared as they were immediately along I-820 to find their way to the south, as the commanders had taken initiative to retreat as they had no command and control that was centralized. They could not reach their battalion commander or their squadron commander, as it was a CAV unit. The total destruction of the 1st of the 204th in a SHORAD operation, which included a carpet munitioning by a single H-6K, as well as massive tactical, ballistic, and cruise missile strikes and artillery strikes from forces within the 19th Artillery Brigade of the PLA's 59th Group Army, the maneuver elements of one light mechanized infantry battalion, along with a armored battalion, also from the 35th Armored Brigade, would overrun the Naval Air Station, while an additional light mechanized infantry battalion and its comprising elements would attack the Meacham International Airport at the same time as the battle was going on over the DFW International Airport, also at this exact time as well. The American logistical forces that had temporarily bivouacked after leaving their armories after being mobilized, including elements within, as in some of the companies within the 949th Brigade Support Battalion, with its Alpha Company actually bivouacking beside the brigade's independent headquarters company, these forces would immediately retreat as artillery fire coming from the 19th was already starting to come in. Even before cruise and tactical ballistic missiles had arrived, these forces had effectively rapidly hightailed it out of their bivouac areas, as initially they were supposed to join up with the 156th Brigade Engineering Battalion and the 3rd of the 133rd in the International Airport. As the artillery fell, chaos reigned amid the forces of the 949th that were present in the empty lot that the federal regime had requisitioned for their use, which was immediately a target as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had acquired all the transaction records for hotels, for bivouac sites, as in rental agreements for lots and properties, and had used these to create targeting for missile strikes, artillery strikes, and airstrikes. And as these forces had immediately fled as soon as artillery began to fall, they had lost some vehicles and some men, but again, panic and chaos had reigned, and they had fled towards Fort Worth, thinking that they could make it possibly to the Naval Air Station, where they might have been safer, as their bivouac sites were clearly not safe enough as artillery was raining down and they were forced to flee. But the Special Operations Battalion of the PLA's 59th Group Army, as they had a single Spec Ops Battalion, which was ground-based, would effectively be guided in as the ISR assets, from the quadcopter assets of local units to the high-altitude assets of all the various high-altitude drones, such as the Stealth WZ-8, there were also another WZ-8 in the area. There's also CH-4As, such as here, that was monitoring this area where they initially began, and also satellite monitoring. And as they were seen fleeing into the southwest of Fort Worth along I-30, the Special Operations Battalion was directed to capture alive, if possible, the command elements of the entire 56th Infantry Brigade combat team, as they were the main force that was in overall command of the defenses of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, even over the 155th Armor Brigade combat team, 2nd of the 198th, which was attached to the 56th, as well as also the SHORAD Battalion, the 1st of the 204th, which was immediately destroyed in the enormous SEAD operation that had occurred at the beginning that was going on now at the same time as the International Airport Battle. As the Special Operations Forces would effectively be fighting in a part of town that was known for low-income housing and was effectively a rougher part of the Fort Worth area, they would end up going street by street with enormous rocket artillery strikes coming in from the 2 rocket artillery battalions of the 19th Artillery Brigade, as well as also 82mm mortar strikes from the Special Operations Forces' own Heavy Weapons Company, as they had a Heavy Special Weapons Company, which also had robotic forces, as they had 12.7mm heavy machine gun armed quad-legged robots. They had also FPV drone operators and sniper spotter teams and a mortar platoon within this heavy special weapons company within their battalion. As the standard special operator companies within the battalion would be tasked with the eradication of the support forces that effectively were fighting alongside of the headquarters forces that were now becoming encircled and trapped by these special operators. They would utilize their anti-tank weaponry to the fullest advantage, as well as their robotics and other high-tech weaponry and FPV drones and more, as they could effectively have their robots draw the fire of crew-served weapons, such as those aboard the MRAPs, as these 250 cal gunners are firing at one of their heavy machine gun equipped robots and would likely destroy it, but as it could either severely damage or outright annihilate certain vehicles with its heavy machine gun, this was of little issue, as they had enormous amounts of these robots and could easily replace them. They would effectively play a key role in not only mowing down American troops and severely damaging vehicles, like causing this engine on this MRAP to badly be smoking, and also the front window and the bullet-resistant glass is beginning to severely crack. The hunter-killer teams, with their anti-tank weaponry, would hit the vehicles that were effectively busy with dealing with these very dangerous robotic threats. And again, although they might lose a few of their robots, it would save the lives of their actual fighting troops. As, again, if the Americans would refuse to destroy these bots would outright annihilate them, so they effectively had to focus a lot of their energy on them. And as a result, the elite special operations troops that were some of the best trained in the world with their hunter-killer tactics would annihilate these vehicles, as 82mm mortars were landing and getting direct hits on buildings that were suspected of harboring American forces, including armed reactionary civilians, as well as rocket artillery completely blanketing entire parts of the city entirely and wiping everybody out, including many tens of thousands of non-combatants. These FPV drones also played a major role in destroying vehicles, like one that had ripped this MRAP into shreds as it blasted on top of it. And as the ATGMs would also destroy these vehicles, this one had been effectively hit in its engine compartment, and a fire had spread and had effectively cooked off Willie Pete grenade rounds for the 203 grenade launchers beneath some of the barrels of rifles of the men who carried those, and it effectively acted as an accelerant and lit the MRAP on fire. And as there were also burning vehicles, as these vehicles had been viciously shot up in the area, the entire city was fast becoming a deadly war zone, as these 3 special operators of a squad, as the rest of their squad is below them, are effectively taking up a fighting position on the ruined top floor of a building, as this building had been directly struck by a mortar, an 82mm mortar from one of their mortar operating teams, and had left a massive hole in the floor, as well as blew the roofing completely off and parts of the wall. And the building was effectively unrecognizable, but the top floor was still usable as a fighting position, as the rest of their squad was below them, firing out of the bottom level at these American forces, as their robots were effectively sweeping the streets of enemy forces. This gas station had also been directly hit by a mortar, which completely shredded it up and ripped up part of this piece of the building. So they had their quadcopter reconnaissance assets moving around to map out the area in real time. Their squad leader of this squad was monitoring and controlling their combat data link and their quadcopter ISR asset, as each and every squad within the PLA forces had their own quadcopter reconnaissance assets. These overlaid with the high-altitude assets to map the area in real time, along with satellite even higher than that. A total 3D mapping of the entire battlefield. As the capture alive of the leadership of the 56th Infantry Brigade combat team was seen as a very high priority, these special operators were the obvious choice for the forces that could achieve this task, as they operated in a very surgical and precise manner, even more so than other PLA units which were fairly elite themselves, like the air assault forces that were now moving into the Fort Worth downtown, the Dallas downtown, and the international airport, as these air assault forces traveled in their Z-20 utility helicopters. The first company of one battalion and the first company of the other would arrive roughly at the same time, as they followed one another on their first shuttle run to drop off their first company of combat troops, their air assault infantry, as the attack helo gunships and the loitering munitions, as well as also the ATGMs fired from a distance by the anti-tank companies within the 3 armored battalions that were assaulting the international airport, were clearing the way for the air assault troops to land, as well as also clearing the way for their own tank companies and their armored infantry to effectively roll up onto the defenses and get into and clear the airport facilities themselves, as these were the main prize, as the DFW International Airport was to become effectively an ultra mega fob, as this was an enormous airport, and this would definitely be the hub of all hubs for the local occupation forces post victory in the war. As we go to the map, as the air assault troops are now beginning their first landing into the area, this was in the Bear Creek Golf Course, which was immediately abutting the airport grounds. And as the combat engineers had dug in the gun positions with berms to effectively protect them, the FAST-Vs and howitzers themselves had turrets whereby they could have crew-serve weapons attached, like the M250 cals, which equipped these howitzers and FAST-Vs. The FAST-Vs carried additional shells, powders, fuses, and primers for the howitzers, and these could carry close to 100 shells apiece, which was a relatively large haul of shells, which made these high priority targets, as the artillery forces could also be equipped with and fire rounds like the Copperhead anti-tank round, which, in fact, in 2 cases during the fight for the airport, the PLA would lose 2 main battle tanks to these shells. However, as these air assault troops came into this area, they had total dominance in terms of firepower, as their helo gunships were far too nimble, fast, and well equipped, as well as also the loitering munition strikes to effectively be endangered whatsoever at all by these forces. As they came in, they fired, as they had the range advantage, they fired their 25mm autocannons as they were up high enough to where they could fire down onto these vehicles. The berms were hardly enough to protect them. They also had their 70mm rocket pods. They also had their ATGMs, which they could carry a variety of different ATGMs depending on which type that was deemed mission essential, as they could be equipped with the HJ-08s, they could be equipped with the AKD-21s or the AKD-10s, and other types of missiles. As these were coming in, they were equipped with HJ-08s, and they would fire these at MRAPs, as this was an FDC vehicle, as each firing platoon of the company, or of the battery rather, as a battery was effectively a company in terms of artillery or air defense forces, as this battery had its 2 firing platoons, and just inside the airport grounds proper along this road here, they had set up their headquarters platoon, and they were beginning to set up their tents, and they were going to use some of these buildings on the outskirts of the airport as their effective headquarters area. This was a gate. They effectively had their Humvee here and another Humvee here, like each platoon had their platoon sergeant that had their Humvees. These were up-armored Humvees. They were setting up again their tents. They had MRAPs as well for security, and they had their crew serve weapons attached to their guns and fast Vs, as each section, or squad effectively in artillery terms, each gun section had enough troops to man the fast V and the gun, so they had half of the section in the fast V and the other half operating the howitzer. And as these forces were preparing their howitzers for any possible fire missions that might come up, as again, before the invasion, the Americans were not fully aware of the extent of whatever type of strike could be levied against them. They were thinking in very limited, small terms. They never imagined that the entire nation could be invaded in such a massive way. They had figured that it would be some type of strike done by possible proxies, and they didn't know exactly where, or they thought maybe the Chinese and Russians conducting their naval drills might conduct limited air strikes or missile strikes. They didn't conceive of a 4th-generation warfare doctrinal invasion of their nation, wherein Trojan shock forces working alongside external forces coming from without the nation, crossing both borders and landing on the beaches, as well as the Trojans breaking out of their CCP regime properties to capture objectives lightning quick, could overwhelm their nation so easily and so rapidly. And thus they were not prepared whatsoever at all for this type of war doctrine. This was the face of modern warfare, and the American military was fighting the war of yesterday and not the war of today. And as the first 2 companies were entering to land their first 2 air assault infantry companies from each of the 2 battalions on their first shuttle operation in to conduct their first landing operation, their attack helo gunships, as their combat aviation companies within each battalion, as each air assault battalion had 1 combat aviation company, came with 8 of the Z-10 attack helo gunships per combat aviation company. So there was a total of 16 of these, although only pictured is the first 8, as the follow-up battalion is right behind the 1st battalion moving in with their first air assault infantry company. As these attack helo gunships are clearing the area, firing their 70mm rocket pods and totally devastating this gun crew and this gun line, this howitzer and fast V, as well as these troops that are outside trying to run in all directions as the scene is now chaotic. This MRAP that was here for security is now trying to move up and fire at some of these helos as they're now coming into view, but gets destroyed by 25mm cannon fire. These troops are all running in different directions. This is a portion of the headquarters platoon as they had effectively set up LMTVs, the fuel truck, and the armored recovery vehicle just behind the gun line's positions. As again, this was in the Bear Creek Golf Course. There are some of the pond traps and the small mounds and hills and little wooded areas in this golf course. There was a creek that flowed through this area and even through the outermost western end of the airport itself, and as the loitering munitions were just coming in as well, they too were striking along with the HJ-08 ATGMs, hitting these vehicles here. This Fast V and this howitzer, this M109A6 Paladin howitzer, is completely annihilated by both an HJ-08 ATGM and a loitering munition. So is this Fast V as well. These troops are also being annihilated and shredded to pieces by the 25mm fire coming from the chain gun beneath the nose of the helo gunship, as this MRAP is also being hit by another HJ-08 ATGM, as is this Humvee all the way off in the distance here. As again, this is a relatively large area. This is a 1.5 mile by 1 mile area, and the HJ-08 has enough range to hit all of these vehicles in this area from where the helos were currently positioned, and so did the rocket pods, which annihilated this portion of the gun line, these two vehicles, and all these troops running in multiple directions, as again, it was getting chaotic. Some were trying to fire hopelessly at these helos as they were bobbing and weaving and maneuvering in the air and were exceedingly difficult to hit, especially with small arms and in such a frantic manner, as these helos as well were firing rocket pods 70mm, destroying this FDC vehicle, which effectively was an M113 high top vehicle. It was known as a high top in slang, as it had a back top that was raised for the equipment for the FDC forces. As again, the gun line had its two firing platoons, and each firing platoon had its own FDC force, its own FDC vehicle. This was the FDC vehicle for this firing platoon, and this was the FDC vehicle for this firing platoon of 3 guns and 3 Fast Vs, or CATs, as they're called, carrier ammunition tracks, or Fast Vs, field artillery supply vehicles. As this MRAP is moving into this area here to try and fire at the helos, it's being shredded up by 25mm fire. ATGMs have been fired and destroying this howitzer, this Paladin M109A6, and this Fast V. These troops are being annihilated by the 25mm fire from the gunship here. These two gunships will move off to the side and continue firing at these targets, hitting with 25mm fire this howitzer and this Fast V, and these two men that were originally moving shells and powder canisters to this howitzer from this Fast V. HJ-08 hits this vehicle, HJ-08 hits this vehicle, these two MRAPs, along with the rocket fires. And as all these troops, these dismounts, are running in all these different directions as their vehicles are getting shredded up by all of the 25mm fire into this area, as well as also the entry of loitering munitions, CH-901As. The scene is simply chaotic, as loitering munitions, which have been circling the battlefield, are now AI piloted and coming in to hit their specific targets as chosen by the AI targeting system, which was attached to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which ultimately chose the targets based on priority. As, again, multiple systems were hitting the same targets at times, it was not uncommon whatsoever at all, as the first company came in to conduct their mass landing operation, as they would exit both sides of their helos and form a diamond formation around their helos before they raised up and left the area to pick up the next company. They would then begin to fan out after securing the LZ and await the other companies to land in the recently secured area so that they could cover the entirety of the south of the international airport to cut off all roads in and out and all other avenues of entry or exit, as these gunships had flown in and effectively annihilated all of the positions utilized by the howitzers and fast Vs, which completely lay in shredded ruins, some where shells had blasted, including blowing out and off the turret from this howitzers, blew out the back where there were shells sitting. And also, this fast V completely rolled over onto its side, 25 millimeter craters from constant impacts from these 25 millimeter fires, ATGM fires from HJ-08s, 25 millimeter fires shredding up this MRAP into pieces. Loitering munitions, which were also striking vehicles and troops, as these were the HE warhead-equipped loitering munitions, which could penetrate and destroy light armored vehicles upon crashing down on top of them, as well as also blast groupings of dismounts together as well. 25 millimeter fire had shredded this fence and blasted it in multiple directions. 25 millimeter impacts. There's also loitering munition strikes going on. A loitering munition had struck this building that was also being utilized as a headquarters. These troops are trying to fire their small arms, but the impact of 25 millimeter fires, all the debris, all of the shrapnel is shredding up this man in the middle of him trying to fire his weapon. So he will be effectively no more. Many of the troops had lost limbs, and their torsos and bodies and heads had effectively blown into multiple pieces, scattered throughout the battlefield. Warfare was very brutal. It was very ugly. It was effectively final. The finality of it was simply brutal. And people were cut down in an instant, as this loitering munition had struck a vehicle right here. This was a loitering munition strike from one of these CH-901As. Body parts and rifles and sandbags, this was from 25 millimeter fire, and more have been thrown in multiple directions. Pieces of vehicles. Absolutely devastating. All to clear a landing zone for the air assault infantry to be able to safely land and be able to spread out and cover a wide area to cut off the retreat, which they would do later in the battle, of any fleeing American forces, as a company of combat engineers would indeed attempt to flee, as the combat would become far too hot, and they would try to effectively flee to better positions, or at least any better position that they could get to that was not at the airport, as the airport was being overrun, savagely so. In the meantime, as the air assault troops were doing their initial landing operations and beginning to enter the battlefield of the international airport, the armored forces were now beginning to close in on the airport as well, and would now receive powerful PLAAF air support, as the airstrikes conducted by the JH-7s, as 2 pairs of these would partake in this particular battle, as well as also even munitions in limited numbers, of course, dropped by 2 pairs of fighter aircraft. A pair of J-10s and a pair of J-11 aircraft would drop their limited air-to-ground munitions in support, while the anti-tank companies, which were already firing their long-distance ATGMs in support of the air assault forces, would also be firing massed HJ-10 strikes in support of their armored infantry within their own battalions, as well as also their tank companies, as these maneuver elements, the tanks and the armored infantry, would effectively be they who would maneuver in to take this airport, as they would close in on all sides, north, south, and east, while the air assault troops covered the south. as the artillery would be pulverizing from the brigade's artillery battalion of the 35th Armored Brigade, as the entire battalion of these PLZ 05 155 millimeter self-propelled howitzers would now all be firing in support of this operation. An enormous number of 155 shells would effectively turn the battlefield into a pockmarked wasteland, as shell craters would be effectively all over the outsides of this airport. Although they were not allowed or sanctioned for the runways themselves or the buildings, the fields that were on the airport grounds that emanated from the runways outward toward the fences were fair game for the artillery as well as the airstrikes. Loitering munitions and HJ-10s as well as tank shells would be used for more of the closer-in fighting as the forces would maneuver in towards the airport structures itself, as they had a distinct range advantage over the American combat engineer forces and even the artillery forces to an extent, because the artillery forces, although they would have had the ultimate range advantage in terms of the Americans versus the Chinese armored forces, they lost this advantage because of their inability to utilize ISR capabilities to create strike packages, and therefore their FDCs could not pass down any fire missions to their gun lines. As again, the Americans had lost all satellite and all internet-related technologies, and also redundant ISR capabilities for many types of portable radars that were not dependent on the internet or satellite to function, as well as radio communications, and thus the artillery forces were completely useless except for firing bore sighting, where they would effectively fire directly at targets, nearly point-blank range, as they could look through the bore before loading shells and powders to fire at targets that were right in front of them. And again, there would be a few that actually had copperhead rounds that would destroy 2 PLA tanks, but there, in effect, were a grand total of 60 of these tanks from the 3 battalions combined assaulting the international airport, and 2 out of 60 was but a drop in the bucket. And the copperheads were effectively the only real effective weapon that the Americans at the airport had that could have taken on the PLA tanks. And again, they had very few of these. They had very few anti-tank weapons in general as an entire brigade as it pertained to the 56, because during the Great Eastern European Proxy Conflict, the Americans had foolishly given away many of their stocks and even their monthly production of these vital anti-tank weapons such as javelins and tows and more. And though the Americans possessed these, they did not possess them in numbers that were sufficient for the type of defense that they were going to need to run against an attacking force of this size and capability and equipment. The Chinese were very advanced, contrary to many biased individuals and sources. The Chinese weapons were actually either equal to or better than their Western counterparts. The technical stats prove this beyond a shadow of a doubt. And their even newer technologies and their mastery of AI, as China led the world in AI, directed energy weapons and lasers, and other critical technologies, this put the Americans at a very distinct disadvantage, as the anti-satellite capabilities of China, their enormity of their cyber warfare arm that they had invested enormous amounts of money into, and their electronic warfare mastery, just as the Russians did as well, made the Chinese forces effectively light years ahead in terms of capabilities. And these capabilities were crushing. Now, the invaded party was suffering massively for falling behind. As this was but the beginning of the fight over the international airport. There will be more to come in the next installation within this hypothetical invasion documentary series, highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines within the scope of a Sino-Russian coalition invasion of America. More to come next.